There's a shift that happens when money stops being a constraint. Most people never witness it.
What changes?
Everything. The poor decide based on survival. The middle class decides based on security. The wealthy decide based on something else entirely: time. When you have resources, you're no longer trading hours for outcomes. You're purchasing years back, decades even. The decision-making framework transforms completely.
How does someone with real wealth actually think?
They eliminate questions most people spend lifetimes answering. Can I afford this? Gone. What will people think? Irrelevant. What if it fails? Acceptable. The wealthy operate in a reality where the stakes are different. Failure doesn't threaten existence, it threatens ego, and ego can be managed. This creates a psychological advantage most will never understand. They can wait. Patience becomes their most powerful asset, not because they're more disciplined, but because they can afford to be. The working professional needs results this quarter. The entrepreneur needs traction this year. The billionaire thinks in generations.
Is it just about having time?
No, it's about having options. Wealth doesn't create better decisions, it creates more decision-making freedom. When you're not desperate, you're not reactive. When you're not reactive, you see clearly. Poor decisions come from pressure, the pressure to perform, to prove, to survive. Remove the pressure and suddenly you're playing a different game. The wealthy don't chase opportunities. They design conditions where opportunities come to them. They build networks that filter information before it reaches the public. They structure entities that shift risk away from themselves. They invest in patience itself.
What about mistakes?
They make them differently. A failed investment for someone with limited resources is catastrophic. A failed investment for someone with wealth is educational. The psychology changes entirely when failure is survivable. This is why generational wealth tends to compound. It's not just the money, it's the mental framework that money permits. You can take risks others cannot. You can think long-term when others must think short-term. You can say no without fear. No is the most valuable word in any language. The ability to decline without consequence is its own form of currency. Most people cannot afford to say no. Their bills demand yes, their circumstances demand compliance. The wealthy say no constantly, to meetings, to investments, to people. They protect attention more carefully than capital.
Why attention?
Because attention is the asset that doesn't scale. You can hire people to manage money. You cannot hire people to think for you. Decision-making quality degrades with distraction. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They structure their lives to minimize cognitive noise. No commutes, no unnecessary meetings, no performances for people who don't matter. Every decision is filtered through a simple question: does this move me toward my actual goals, or does it just feel productive? Most people confuse motion with progress. The wealthy confuse nothing. They also decide differently about people.
How so?
They can afford to be selective in ways others cannot. When your network determines your survival, you tolerate mediocrity. You maintain relationships out of necessity. When your network is a choice, you curate ruthlessly. The ultra-wealthy don't have friends in the traditional sense. They have alignments, people whose interests overlap with theirs for mutual benefit. This sounds cold because it is, but it's also honest. They don't waste energy on relationships that don't serve a function, not because they're cruel, but because they've learned that time with the wrong people is time stolen from the right ones. They make decisions about health differently too. The middle class goes to the doctor when something is wrong. The wealthy prevent something from going wrong in the first place. Concierge medicine, preventative diagnostics, longevity protocols most people have never heard of. They're not healthier because they have better genetics. They're healthier because they can afford to optimize before problems appear. Every decision becomes an investment in future capacity.
What about legacy?
Legacy is where decision-making reveals its true nature. The poor spend what they have. The middle class save what they can. The wealthy build what lasts. Generational thinking changes everything. When you're deciding not just for yourself, but for children and grandchildren who haven't been born yet, you become conservative in ways that look reckless to others. You don't chase trends, you identify what endures. You don't maximize this quarter's returns, you protect against next century's risks. Family offices exist for this reason, not just to manage money, but to institutionalize decision-making across generations. They create frameworks so that even when the founder's gone, the principles remain. This is power in its purest form, decisions that outlive you. The wealthy also understand something about identity that most people miss.
What's that?
They separate who they are from what they do. When your survival depends on your job, your identity merges with your work. You become what you do. When wealth removes that dependency, you remember that work is just a choice, one of many. This detachment allows clearer thinking. You can walk away from bad situations without existential crisis. You can pivot without shame. You can experiment without risk to your sense of self. The psychology of wealthy decision-making isn't about being smarter. It's about operating in an environment where the penalties for being wrong are reduced and the rewards for being patient are amplified. This creates a compounding advantage. Better decisions lead to better resources. Better resources enable better decisions. Over time, the gap doesn't just widen, it becomes unbridgeable. Not because of talent or intelligence, but because of structural position.
Really?
Yes, the most profound shift happens in how the wealthy perceive problems. What looks like a crisis to most people looks like volatility to them, temporary, manageable, sometimes even opportunistic. They've learned that most problems solve themselves with enough time and resources, so they don't panic, they don't react, they observe and adjust. This calm isn't spiritual, it's mathematical. When you have reserves, you can afford to wait for clarity before acting. Decision-making becomes an art form when it's no longer performed under duress. The question isn't whether wealth changes how people decide. The question is whether you can adopt the decision-making frameworks of wealth before you have it. Some can, most won't, because it requires thinking like someone whose survival isn't on the line. And that's a psychology most people cannot access until the money arrives. By then, the patterns are set. The greatest decisions aren't made with money. They're made with the freedom money provides.
So which comes first?
That's the paradox you'll have to solve for yourself.
Okay. Thank you for your time today. We learned many things we didn't know. Thanks again.